First and foremost, seizure warning. There will be lots of strobes. Also, content warning. This is an hour-long amateur documentary about a specific line of Whelen Engineering emergency lights. You have been warned. I'm going to tell the story of the Whelen Commander, a series of lights that ran from 1966 to 1991 and encompassed a variety of models used in a variety of ways. In the 1950s, Whelen was porting their products over from the aviation industry to the ground market, the vehicular industry. Most of their products consisted of a lighthouse-style beacon or a incandescent or halogen bulb with prisms rotating around it. In 1956, one was placed on a motorcycle for police purposes, and this was what they considered to be their move into the emergency vehicle realm. The size of these lights started out airline-sized, and eventually a larger senior version came along, and then another even larger size came along. So they really had three basic sizes, although they had 6 models. It was really a matter of what duty level they considered them. But essentially there were 3 sizes of rota-beam beacons is what they called them. Those were all the prism-based beacons, and that was the Whelen market. These 6 lights in these 3 basic sizes. In 1966, a larger size was added called the Rotabeam Commander. This was an oscillating 4-sealed beam lamp that gave 205 degrees of oscillation of the 4 bulbs. That means under a clear dome, you could have 3 separate colors visible to any given side at one time. And in this particular case, the last known remaining example that I am aware of has a white bulb that rotates front and side, 2 red bulbs that rotate or oscillate rather side, and an amber that oscillates side and rear. So an early version of no white light to the rear and no amber light to the front. That was how this was set up, and I don't know of any others of these left remaining, but that was the first commander-sized beacon. It used a row motor, which was very similar to some of the other beacons, and it had a mounting plate with internal mechanism. The light itself looked very much like later 4-sealed beam rotating lights in the 8.8 series, but it oscillated. And it was the first light that got any sort of designation at all of commander. As you can see here, the sweep is pretty extensive, and it really did allow for a lot more flexibility in what lamp colors you wanted to point to any given side of a vehicle. Here we're just watching the extent of the sweep of the clear bulb and how it is going front and side but never fully to the rear. We could track the amber in the same way, or each red individually. As I had stated, this is the last known example of this particular beacon. It was made in, we believe, 1966, at least that's when it was first advertised, and when the last one was manufactured is unknown, although it was not extremely popular. The oscillating version of the Federal Signal beacon ray was more popular, although still not one of their more popular products. So while oscillating lights did pop up on aircraft as well, they were not something that was commonly used. Steady burn, flashing, or rotating was far more common in the 1960s into the 1970s. So this oscillating mechanism that gives the larger 205 degree sweep was unique in the industry, And although it never caught on, it certainly was ahead of its time as far as I'm concerned, just based on the ability to designate which lamp colors were seen from which sides of the vehicle. Of course, throw a red dome on this with clear bulbs and it really doesn't matter, although you definitely or arguably would get more pop, if you will, if more bulbs pass in and out of the viewer's field of view. I don't want to start a comment war about the Federal Signal beacon ray and this light. They were different. They did similar things, but they're not the same light. And neither was extremely popular. And both are now pretty rare. I would argue this one being more rare since I don't know of another example still around. The setup that it's in now was the setup that it was found in essentially, and it has been run several times since then, but is mainly just the cornerstone of a collection of an era gone by. In the late 1960s into the early to mid 1970s, Whelen started experimenting with strobe technology, first on aircraft, and then eventually moved off of aircraft onto emergency vehicles. A 1967 patent was issued and was run under Austin Electronics at the time. That, of course, later became an amber market term for Whelen, but the strobe side of their operations consisted of aircraft at first, and they used an Austin Electronics main board that was a single board capacitor-driven design with a very small variety of remote light heads. Later examples had several boards mounted together, but the very first ones were quite simple. The first vehicular mount strobe was actually a Deputy Model 44 with an aircraft strobe inside. Where does that leave us commander-wise? Well, sometime between 1968 and 1969, the Darley catalog started offering the Strobe Commander, or Strobe 5000. This was the Rotabeam Commander in a strobe package. It seemed to replace the Rotabeam Commander in the sense that there are no more flyers or advertisements for the Rotabeam Commander after the Strobe Commander, or 5000, hit the market in 1968. In 69, the Senior Strobe that you see on the crossbar here also debuted. But the first Strobe Commander, or 5000 series Strobe Commander, was the Rotabeam Commander with a strobe inside. And very early on, they utilized a very specific optic. As you can see, it is bullseye, either to the front or the sides. The user could decide as it rotated. However, the optic was not 100% symmetrical. It was somewhat of a trapezoid, so if you did face the bullseye to the front, one of your side flutings was slightly larger than the other, and how users did that varied from application to application. All the literature I've seen pictures it with the bullseye forward, and it's very hard to tell from the literature which way the optic was oriented otherwise. The example in the E-Lightbars collection is a very early example for a couple of reasons. We know this. One is that the bottom is not sealed. It has the Strobe Commander label instead of the later style label, and also the power supply, which we'll get into a little bit later. But these flashed at about 60 to 80 flashes per minute. Here you can see the light with the optic facing in the forward trapezoid position, which gives the bullseyes to the side and the fluted to the front and rear. Again, a simple loosening of the screw on the dome retaining band would allow you to change the orientation to any orientation you saw fit. And the optics inside the Commander strobe series would remain directional in the sense that they had a front or a side that was different moving onward for some time. However, this particular optic was not even a Whelen produced optic. As we'll see shortly, this optic was borrowed from another industry, and if Whelen's previous industry experience tells us anything, it's that they came from the world of aviation. So that's exactly where this internal diffuser was in fact borrowed from. The optic for the Strobe Commander was actually borrowed from a runway lamp, not a lamp that went on an actual plane. And there were some modifications. Well, a modification. The top was ground off, leaving an open top. However, pretty much a direct use of a system that was an existing optic for runway lights. Here you can see with the top on, with the arrow showing which way is supposed to be towards the runway. And here you can see with the top ground off, which is how Whelen used it in the Strobe Commander. Originally, I had positioned the optics in mine this way, which is the way that the arrow, before you grind the top off, indicates should go towards the runway. But later, looking at the literature, I was convinced to turn mine to the side to put the bullseye forward. And I'm left wondering which side I should give the short side of the trapezoid fluting to. Notice there is no cruise light. It's just a single strobe bulb. And the strobe bulb isn't raised particularly high. It just barely hits the bottom of the bullseye optic. But it does hit it. I believe the top was simply cut off for the purposes of fitting the existing Rotabeam Commander dome, or the future 5000 series Commander dome, over the optic. I don't think it was a heat issue. It just is a matter of getting the dome over it. The optic itself is glass. It is quite heavy, and it just fits by size alone. The tray in which it sits doesn't have any clips or clamps or screws. It literally just sits there. There's not a lot of movement. The dome does retain it well with the dome retention ring, but it's not screwed down or anything. Here's a view of the strobe bulb being raised up a little bit to hit that bullseye optic, which, like I said, it does accomplish. And with the bullseye to the front, you get a much more focused beam, which would make sense as to why, they wanted the bullseye to the side for a runway light. They wanted a more diffuse light towards the runway and a more directional light perpendicular to the runway, which makes sense. So I suppose that's why it's shown that way in literature, and so that's, I guess, how I'll be leaving this example. It's not really known how the model numbers were set up. However, we do know that this is an extremely early version based on the power supply, or the lack of power supply more accurately. So I am pretty proud of my example. I think it's in relatively good condition, and I do like displaying it as part of the E-Light Bars collection. And I think it does represent a good, an interesting part of strobe history. This is a very early example, and we will get into why I believe that by taking a look at this unit's power supply. So the power supply on this example is attached with the rivets noted there in that very specific pattern. And it's a very small single board Austin Electronics power supply. There's no mother-daughter board. It's just a single board supply, which was exactly what they used on their very, very first power supplies. They didn't go mother-daughter until later. And then that power supply did, however, find its way onto the strobe commander of the glass optics for a while. As you can see, my example here, open power supply, single board, normal capacitors, but just the single Austin Electronics board there. It fires the strobe bulb as you would expect it to. It works just like the aircraft supply of the same type, but it was just open down there, and it's quite simple and small without any additional secondary boards, and represents their first strobe patent directly from the aircraft industry. So here's early versus late. Late's on the left, early's on the right. You can see there's a mother-daughter board scenario on the one on the left. This particular one was open, although you can see the chassis there would support closed sides, like an aircraft supply, or a later version that did have an enclosed power supply. But you've actually got 1, 2, 3, 4 circuit boards versus the single one. You have mother, daughter, and then the side supplementals. So the example I have is a direct port from the absolutely first aircraft power supplies, and other glass diffuser models started using that later aircraft power supply. Whether that be in an open environment like this, or some of them, I believe, were contained, much like later models. So the later power supplies here were very similar between this and aircraft supplies, just like the early model. But they got more complex, and essentially it was for reliability, theoretically for brightness and pacing. Overall, they gained FAA approval, and that was what came out of it, was that better power supply. You can see that these examples, the rivet or screw holes, are in much different places than the example I have. They're lined up to hold the aircraft power supply, the type that would go in the metal can, if you will, not the single board original Austin one that is on the example that Eli Bars demonstrated. The bases varied a little bit, although they did vary within years as well. But we think that the later model with the glass optics did enclose the power supply. We do know for sure that it became the mother-daughter dual stacked board supply. Whether or not the metal cover that goes over that power supply was always present, sometimes present, never present, present dependent on model, we're not 100% sure. But later models of the Commander used the same power supply, but enclosed, like you see here, which is exactly how they enclosed their aircraft power supplies. So first generation, open, simple. Second generation would be open, more complex, and then the last generation of the glass optics, we believe, were canned or closed power supplies, like the next generation would end up having. So the next generation, which came out around 1973, simply borrowed optics again, but this time borrowed it from the ground division or the vehicle division, but we still cut a hole in the top. I'm not sure if that was for heat, but the optic was the same as the senior strobe, and the model DMS strobe was just a cut down version of that. This internal spreader does have a front. The fluting in the spreader is different. It kind of focuses the light towards the front, which is again something that the glass one was kind of doing as well. They would mark the front on these domes, and that would tell you which way the light would be most focused, and that was by means of the fluting. So again, a borrowed optic, but this time borrowed from themselves. And this is when you start seeing cruise lights as well. Sometimes two, sometimes one. But here's how the fluting looks. You can see it is kind of angled towards the front to concentrate the flash to the front of the light. It's pretty subtle in person, but it does make some difference, I suppose. The shape is not that noticeable till you look for it, which is why I think they were pretty clear on stamping front and putting a big arrow on it. They did the same thing with their senior strobes that were made from that were the internal optics, and they did the same thing in the 6000 series light bar. And you'll see that the Commander is going to kind of mirror the optics of the light bars of the time. Right now, the 5000 Commander is mirroring the 6000 light bar, which is super rare as well, both of which utilize the optics from the quote senior strobe, just cutting the tops off when they were inside another dome. Many different products offered with this spreader and or light diffuser, but the Commander was certainly one of them, retaining its 5000 designation while doing so. Initially, the generation of the Commander with the internal optics borrowed from the senior strobe or single flash, they utilized that same aircraft power supply that the later generation of the glass optic ones used. Single flash, and the speeds varied greatly. Mostly component based, and some of those variations may be blamed upon component degradation over age, but you can also affect the rate a little bit by changing the power cutoff as to when it fires or how long it builds before it fires, which there's a small potentiometer inside the power supply for that. But in general, we're still looking at the same single strobe power supply, approximately 60 flashes per minute. You're looking at a single head here, so you're not alternating anything. You're simply firing the one bulb unless you were in a crossbar scenario, which in a crossbar scenario, multiple heads were utilized off the one supply, usually in the base of one beacon, and those were very similar to the aircraft supplies as well. Again, contained in a metal can, as we called it, and the metal can supplies lasted for quite some time. They worked very well in the aircraft industry, and they worked quite well in the automotive industry, and they served the Commander beacon from its inception through its 5000 series quite well. The bases varied significantly. Right now, the examples I have are all polished metal, but there were speaker bases, there were closed bases, open bases, crossbar bases, clear domes with internal colors, colored domes with clear internals, again on a crossbar, not on a crossbar, and the 6000 bar mirrored this completely, and when used by itself as a senior strobe, same deal. So you're kind of doing the same thing that the original Commander did, which was put some existing technology inside of a bigger footprint beacon, and that was quite successful for them. This particular model does run a little bit faster than 60 flashes per minute. I have worked on the power supply in this model, and I have tuned the clipping or cutoff, and I have gotten it pretty close, although there's a sacrifice of brightness if I bring the speed down anymore. So I've left it right at its brightest, where it comes in at almost 80 flashes per minute, closer to 90 sometimes. And again, you're dealing with a lot of aging electronic components in these, so that's kind of to be expected. They definitely are a product of their age, being electronic components. The main component being capacitors, which if you don't use them, you lose them, much like muscle tissue. So I do turn these on to exercise them from time to time and recondition the capacitors. And I find that they work a lot better if they are used from time to time. But this particular single flash version of the 5000 Commander with this particular internal optic was a mainstay powerhouse, and even when strobe technology changed, the exterior of this particular product did not, if that explains how happy they were with the overall footprint in general. So again, that power supply, stolen or borrowed from the aviation industry, supporting one up to 4 heads when used on a crossbar or in a 6000 series. This was the mainstay power supply of the single flash era, and actually continued into the double flash era, but it usually mounted in a can, is what it's commonly referred to, and it was used to fire a variety of different things, from the 5000 beacon to par 46 strobes on a crossbar. And then in aviation, you could have your wingtip, your tail, etc. But this particular style was seen in the late glass optics and was utilized in the single flash Lexan or senior strobe open top optics as well. You could certainly fire, like I said, a variety of strobes with one of these. In this case, we're actually only firing 3 of these, but again, that was the idea. They were pretty accommodating. In this case, I was tuning a single output one to put back in the Commander. Here I'm tuning the clipping or the cutoff, and it changes the overall brightness when it cuts off charging and actually fires, but that also does have a little effect on the rate. But moreover, it's changing when it cuts off the charge cycle into a discharge. So adjusting that for maximum brightness was not something they wanted the average user to do. These cans were riveted shut, but you'll find on a lot of these beacons that they've been opened, and the quote no user serviceable parts inside have definitely been serviced. All of these components, aside from the boards, are consumer purchasable electronics, and if a resistor failed, it could be easily replaced with some basic soldering skills, and when things went a little haywire, you could tune it to some extent with the potentiometer as well. So a lot of times we do find these that they've been opened up, and opened up they look a lot like the uncased version that was seen in the original Commander. So in 1975 or 1976, the 5000 wasn't going anywhere, But strobe technology had changed. The double flash or strobe 2 power supply was making its debut in the vehicular world, and the Commander was not an exception to this. You would see strobe 2 proudly displayed on the labels of these lights when they went to double flash, and it affected all the models. And you could get strobe 2 technology in all of them, and sometimes it was just a little written on number, Roman numeral 2, and other times they actually put a label on there. But in the early days, they just put a magic marker Roman numeral 2 to let you know it was the strobe 2 version, which proved very popular for a very long time. Then the labels started saying strobe 2. A strobe 2 power supply was designed for the vehicular market, so they varied in the number of outlets they had. The Commander beacons generally had one, unless it was on a crossbar, then it would have the number it needed. They came in a variety of voltages, actually, but 12 was the most common. And the double flash didn't vary quite as much in speed, although if you had a 2-head power supply, you could jumper it to flash the single head twice as fast in some cases. So sometimes there would be some tampering, and we would find a strobe 2 beacon that was flashing really fast, and usually that was a product of it having been replaced with a 2-head power supply and being flashed in double time, if you will. So that is one of the quote user mods that you would find for these strobe 2 versions. And I don't think it made them any more noticeable. In fact, it put them out of the range for being compliant warning devices in certainly California, but definitely around the world, and as far as SAE was concerned. I did note that you could get these in a variety of voltages. While this one was field modified, the voltage number was often written in just like that, or sometimes with magic marker. This one being 48 volts now. It wasn't originally, but the power supply that's in it, the strobe 2 48 volt supply, was from a different one that was damaged. But you could get them in a variety of voltages to accommodate different types of vehicles. 48 was pretty common for electric-powered utility vehicles, so you would see those from time to time. Locomotives would be sometimes up in the 60s or 70s, and that could be accommodated as well. And of course, you could do, there were AC conversions available, whether advertised or not, they did exist. The flash rate overall was very similar. Strobe 2 was a lot more consistent in flash rate than single flash. The strobe 2 technology was very specific. It had an initial high pulse and then a follow-up secondary pulse, so that might be a reason for it being so specific. So strobe commander wise, from left to right, we have the original glass, single strobe with the Lexan optic, and then the strobe 2 with the same internal optic, but the strobe 2 clearly visible on the front all the way down the line here. And that's kind of the early evolution from the glass optic to the borrowed from the senior strobe optic, starting with a very simple single board, single flash supply, moving to a mother-daughter board single flash supply, and then ending in a similarly contained double flash strobe 2 power supply. In the late 1970s, the 5200 series debuted, along with the 8000 series light bar. The all-new Commander was a larger footprint, as was the 8000 series bar, and they both shared something known as the flying saucer optic. You could get them colored, wrapped in color, or clear, and they sat on what we call a pie pan supply. The power supply would be contained within this little metal skirt that, like I said, is referred to as the pie pan. What was in there did change, but initially when the pie pans came out, cruise lights became rare again, and the Commander, as well as the 8000 series light bar, sported the flying saucer optic. The flying saucer optic was pretty bright. It distributed the flash quite well. It went on and off relatively easily. It just used a lot of material, and it was made in two halves. It was like a clamshell, and I believe glued together, a top and a bottom. And it still had the hole at the top. I'm not 100% sure why it was abandoned, but it was seen, like I said, colored as well as clear, wrapped in a colored film in the 8000 series bar, as well as inside the Commander 5200. And it served the 8000 and 5200 Commander pretty well, and was seen for a few years. These are considered a little bit more rare in the 5200 series. I did recently obtain and service a 75 volt model, which was almost certainly on a railroad locomotive, and it required very little service. It was double flash as they are. It needed a new bulb, and it needed a couple of minor electronic components, but I did a full repair on it, and if you don't want to see it taken apart and put back together, then there's a section here you can skip. But the design overall I thought was quite good, and it by far is not significantly inferior light output wise to later optics. I was very pleased to find this 75 volt version, because that's not incredibly common, but it worked. My power supply maxes out at 65, and it worked just fine. It's a good view of the earlier pie pan strobes. It would have the capacitors off to the side, and you can see it is 75 volts. And that sort of pie pan lasted for even longer than the flying saucer optic, but was also used in the 8000 bars, which meant you could put one on each side and power more strobes. It was very modular, easy to service, usable in a variety of products, and it served them pretty well in the various products they used it in. I was interested to see exactly the changes that were made for 75 volts, and there really weren't a lot of them. Being that it was still DC, it was pretty much just a matter of a couple changes in different component tolerances and ratings. You can see there are 4 holes that would be for mounting the standard transistor, but this one actually has it inside due to the 75 volt nature of the supply. The flying saucer design served Whelen well and was used for several years, and is one of the more sought after 5200s, and I was glad to add this one to my collection and to get it working. In the early 80s, there was a change in internal optics. There were two different types. The first one that came along was what I call the two-part. It was a sort of ring of plastic with a cap on top held down by springs. It kind of yellowed pretty easily. It wasn't very sturdy. They get very brittle and they don't hold up very well. They're pretty hard to find intact. They have a very, very fine set of lines on them for the diffusing properties, but they do a very good job of diffusing the light. They just weren't extremely practical. The required ring at the top pulling down on the very thin plastic didn't work out great, but you did see it in the 8000 and you also saw it in the Commander. Then after that they made a one-piece diffuser. In this case it was glued down, but in this one here it's held with springs as well. This was a thicker diffuser, and it had different spacing in the middle. It was a little bit more robust, still held down with springs unless it was glued like that first amber example, which was a special order. But you were still seeing the PyPan strobes. There were a couple changes to them, but they were primarily very similar. And so you had this... it was also used in the super strobe when that came along, the internal diffuser, but it clamped into the super strobe, whereas it was held down with the springs in the Commander. This optic held up by far a lot better and is usually the one that you find intact now. And I don't see a huge amount of noticeable difference between the two optic styles. They're both considered later optics post-flying saucer, but the two-piece version was abandoned somewhat quickly just because of how it held up, I believe. This is an example of the two-piece optic. Both of these beacons are using it. It does just fine. It makes a very nice diffuse light. There's really no problem with it, aside from the fact that it didn't hold up to the sun very well, especially underneath clear domes, and that it would crack when it became fatigued. It was a fine way to diffuse the internal light. These strobes are using the later one-piece or super strobe model, and it's kind of hard to really tell the difference. So again, this is what you would see in the first model, the two-piece. And we're just kind of trying to compare them to show you just how different they were in construction, but really probably not that much different in light output. So under red domes, again, it looks fine. It works just fine. It diffuses the light just fine. And I'm hard-pressed to tell the difference between the two-piece and the one-piece diffusers myself, side by side. In fact, in maybe this shot, I did one of each. I really can't tell. That's how similar they looked, is that I don't remember which clip I did one and one. So they were a very, very similar thing. The difference would be how they held up. And I think we're going to show here that this was the two-piece one. The single-piece one did fit in the super strobe, which came out around the same time, so that was a bonus. But the two-piece one worked just fine. Didn't hold up as well, but was common throughout both the 8000 and the Commander series at the time when it was offered. Getting a little bit more in depth on the single piece diffuser, specifically the one held in place with the springs here. That was usually seen with the slotted base versus the round holes. But the power supplies started to change a little bit. It was common to see what would be described as an early edge power supply, or more similar to an early edge power supply. At this time, the 8000 series light bar and the Whelen Edge were running side by side in the product line. So the board was shared. It was the Whistler series of power supplies, a little bit larger supply than you would think of for an Edge, but it was shared between the 8000 and the Edge, which means it was also placed inside of the Commander beacons. And it had adequate light output. It was still in a pie pan format, so it still served the same purpose. With the age differences, I'm not really sure I can tell the difference between the power supplies other than the sounds are a little bit different, but you could actually get sound differences between the same models just depending on the components. The internal spreaders on these are definitely all the single piece. However, the light bar below it is flying saucers. So to make a comparison, if you can even tell, between the most recent, if you will, single piece plastic diffuser and the original 5200 or 8000 flying saucer's on the bottom in the light bar, and the single piece is in all three beacons on the top. And again, both are quite adequate. Again, just probably a matter of production and a little bit of tweaking. It's not technically apples to apples because the power supplies aren't the same, but they both seem to be providing adequate light output. Also, I wish I hadn't turned the par 46 strobes on in the light bar. It's a little bit distracting and kind of takes away from the comparison. Some people have said they think there's like a hot spot in the later diffusers, and I'm not sure if that's true. There certainly was a wider area in the center of that diffuser, and when combined with a cruise light, yeah, there was kind of a line of light in the middle, but you can kind of see that in the two-piece diffuser as well. And since you didn't get a lot of cruise lights in the Flying Saucer series, it's really hard to make an apples to apples with this. So, I don't know. I guess you could argue it either way. I also have the cruise lights pointed dead forward in these particular strobes, so that probably is swaying things a little bit and not making it a completely fair comparison. With the dome removed and the cruise light positioned to the side, the 5200 used a single cruise light, whereas the 5000 would often use two. I think you can kind of see where the bias is coming in. That cruise light hits right in the middle of that less fluted section, and it kind of does make a brighter spot there. Again, a lot of it's what direction you're looking at the light from and what bulb you have in the cruise light socket. And I think the two-piece diffuser had a tendency to do this a little bit too, but some of the two-piece diffusers also, you'd find a lot smaller cruise light bulbs in them too. So again, I'm not sure that it's necessarily all the optic to blame. Another thing that could be addressed is specifically in the large-sized domes, both due to sun fade and manufacturing discrepancies. Whelen had a lot of different colors of blue on the tape. The far left beacon is the darker blue CIE European blue, but even within the blues and the ambers to some extent, there was some variation in color even before sun fading, which was a problem. The darker blue European flash didn't really show up that much differently, but it was noticeable. The other thing is the voltage. 24 volt beacon here has a glued in diffuser, no springs, and a different shade of amber or yellow than some of the other products. Their ambers varied quite a bit as well. I'm not sure the voltage played a huge role here, but this is a very nice example of amber for them. This particular 24 volt model had both the glued-in diffuser and the very true amber color. So it puts forth a very brilliant yellow amber flash versus a kind of cold washed out yellow one or an almost red deep one. So this was, in my opinion, the pinnacle of the perfect amber color. So you could vary from that and get a lighter yellow or a darker yellow, and that could play into things too. And I think it showed up more in the Commander series just because the domes were so big. It was a lot easier to spot the difference, even though the difference had been there all along. It was a product of just the materials and the manufacturing process. One of the things that the Commanders changed besides optics were definitely power supplies. Like we talked about, the first generation pie pans had the single board with the capacitors on either side. And that stuck around through different optic changes, and since these were used for the 8000 bar as well, it stuck around while that was the main bar, and they worked just fine and could be adapted relatively easily to power more than one strobe lamp. And then they changed a little bit, but all in all, it was generally a very similar design during that period where it was a true pie pan board design, if you will, with the capacitors off to the side on brackets like this. And that's how you can kind of tell the difference, is your capacitors will be off to the side, held in with those brackets. In the late 80s, when the Edge came out, like we talked about, the supplies in the 8000 and the Commander mirrored the Edge. There was no reason not to do this. Why build different power supplies for similar applications? So your Commander beacons, your 8000 bars, and your Edge bars were sharing a power supply board. All the way from pretty much when the Edge debuted, with the supply shown here that we called the Whistler, if you will, until the product was canceled, which would have been closer to this Edge supply board. They just mirrored it, and that made a lot of sense. It kept things very uniform, and since the Edge bar was able to support up to 4 outlets, there was no reason not to use an Edge supply. 4 outlets was all you would ever need in a single pie pan, and honestly, it meant that you didn't have to put a supply in each pie pan, theoretically, if you wanted to load up a bar with 2 360s and 2 directionals. You would have to put one in each pie pan if you wanted to have 4 directionals on at the same time. But using the Edge power supply, not with the heat fin shown here, obviously, but using it strapped to a pie pan as a heat fin just made a lot of sense. And we saw that pretty much mirror the Edge all the way to the end of this product line. So from 1984 until the early 90s, when it was discontinued, special versions of the Commander would come out. You saw the Darth Vader, which was the speaker base with the takedown lights. You saw dual versions off the crossbar. The Darth Vader light is probably the most iconic. It gave you the option to add takedowns or strobes or flashing halogens or steady burn halogens that weren't takedowns below the Commander beacon, and have a speaker. And of course, obviously, we know why we call it the Darth Vader beacon. It has a very, very specific look, and you can almost hear the breathing and the music when you see this particular light. It's considered one of the more rare variants. I believe it's Kentucky State Police used it for a while, but it was not highly popular, and it represented the end of the run of the Commander product line. The Darth Vader light was actually called the 5300, but no one cares. And that one pictured here, I think actually is pictured with the wrong power supply. This guide for upgrading your current 5200 into a Darth Vader might be why there was the wrong power supply in that one. They did make a retrofit kit, which would explain the two-piece optic and the old supply. The speakers varied as to what you put in there. Again, it may be an analog of whether you upgraded or bought it that way. But it is worth saying that they did feature an upgrade kit so you could turn your Commander into a Darth Vader Commander if it already had a speaker. The example in the E-light bars, or my collection, is the blue dome with the 360 strobe, the cruise light, and the takedowns. The cruise light is positioned, I think, in a way that doesn't give too much washout. This one was not a retrofit, so it has an edge style power supply and it has the newer style optic. The takedowns were 4x3 27 watt halogens. You could put Micromax strobes there as well, which would be run off of that edge style power supply. And you could also theoretically do one takedown and one strobe, one takedown, one steady burn, whatever you wanted to do. The features were independently switchable. You could do just the strobe, just the cruise light, just the takedowns, just the secondary strobes. The whole thing was very modular, and especially when you bought it as that package, you had quite a few options, almost as many as a full light bar out of this. Whether or not it looked ridiculous is up for debate, but among enthusiasts, it's considered one of the cooler looking platforms for the Commander beacon throughout the years. It definitely is a innovative way to pack features that law enforcement was starting to demand into a beacon platform instead of a light bar. And it arguably gave you pretty much what you would want, what people were demanding in light bars, at least at a minimum, in a beacon. And with the upgrade kit, you could justify moving your old 5200 Commander with just the speaker onto your new car and not replace it, but get takedowns. So it was an interesting innovation. I wish it would have stuck around longer, but pretty much by the time these went away in the early 90s, very few agencies besides Michigan State Police were running single beacons anymore. There was also the version with the forward-facing PAR 36 under the dome, which blocked half of the 360 strobe. It was usually a strobe. Legend has it that people made them California beacons as well. But you had this forward-facing PAR 36, and then you had the front and rear cutoff modules that used edge V-tubes with a divider down the middle to do a front-rear cutoff. The divider's looking a little droopy here, but you certainly can see how the idea of having an edge V-tube on front and rear, and you could do 360 front only or rear only, which again was a product of the supply. This also caused a lot of split domes to be on the market, which is great because we all love split domes. You'd see amber to the rear sometimes. So by the end of 1991, special order only was how you would get the Commander. And then in 1992 or 1993, you couldn't even special order it. What was in stock was what they had, and then it went away. So this was a pretty long run for the product name, if not the product. What started with an oscillating four-sealed beam lamp taken from an idea that served the aviation industry, went through a natural progression but kept being relevant long enough to make its way through many generations of lights. And the name itself outlasted some whole light companies. The original coming from an aircraft idea being the roto-beam itself, all the way to the first strobe version being an aircraft supply stuck underneath the larger footprint with an aircraft landing runway light glass internal spreader. The aviation industry just had so much to do with Whelen's early days. The Commander had its roots in aviation, and it definitely developed from there. But if any one product shows just how much aviation played into Whelen's history, the Commander could certainly be it. The Commander changed internal optics multiple times, but only really changed footprints arguably twice, the 5000 and the 5200. So you've got two basic footprints with a variety of different things inside, and things progressing as technology progressed. The Commander progressed right along with it. It seemed to be just the right size for a variety of applications, and it definitely was able to keep up with the demand for innovation and new features, both due to its size and just the fact that the 8000 light bar specifically and then the Edge power supply were interchangeable within it. So that certainly helped its tenure. But overall, the Commander beacon is really as good a metaphor for Whelen's development and continued innovation as any other product that they've offered, from a birth in the skies to ongoing innovation on the ground. I think the Commander is a great way to tell the story of Whelen engineering as a whole and not just about the light. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.